It's blowed in there. It's just loaded in slash weight.
What is that noise?
And it just shows you how big he is, how heavy he is.
Okay, we are live. Thank you guys for taking the time to look into this property. Thank you for the time that you spent preparing yourself with DocuSign and FMLS and the disclosures and all that kind of stuff to form a offer that is ready to go as if I'm the listing agent. Okay, I'm just going to send out a quick reminder to everybody. They're running a little late on Mastermind, so hopefully hopefully people can file in here in just a second. Please join us for launch Mastermind and mock offer review now. All right, beautiful. Okay, finally met Andrew today. That was fun. Okay. What's that?
Real life meeting.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Thank you guys. Anytime you have any questions, anytime you have any questions as you're putting together an offer, what documents to include, all that kind of stuff, just reach out to myself or Susan or Kathy Ray, who are the agent mentors, okay? Let's start off by, let's go back to the very beginning. Talk to me about your opinion of value of this property. What did you see as you were going through the comparables? Then we'll get to the contracts.
Well, what I took from it, I think that the person selling the house, I think they priced it right. When I looked at the comps in the area of what was closed, what was pending, everything, I want to say the one that was closed, and it closed in December, that one was $299, but everything else was priced between that $320 and $340, whether it was withdrawn or pending or active. So I do think that the seller priced the house right.
Yeah, and by the way, like for example, this is just my personal opinion. If you go and ask a bunch of real estate agents, they may have a slightly different opinion. But it's nice to be on the bracket. What I mean by that is I don't want to price them at $324.9. Okay, I want to price it at $325 because people search for like $300 to $325, and if I'm at and then $325 to $350. If I'm at $324.9, I only end up in one of those brackets. If I'm at $325 on the nose, I end up in both of them. My personal opinion is we're not selling a T-shirt here. It shouldn't be $9.99, right? We're selling something a lot more expensive than that. Okay, so just so you hear these out loud, we got offers of $325, $325, $310, $325, and $330 actually. Okay, so we're pretty close, and Trace is an experienced agent. I have no doubt that he priced that home correctly. Okay, so good work on that. All right, let's start with the purchase and sale agreement, and I'm just going to go through section by section. What I am not going to do is call out people for their mistakes. Okay, I'll just throw out the names of the some of the things that I see here and let you know how I believe it could have been done better. Okay, but I asked for you guys to be vulnerable, and my intention is not to make you feel bad for just following the assignment as a new agent. Okay, so good work to everybody. Okay. First section, I'm on page 1 of the purchase and sale agreement. Okay, you guys all did really good at identifying the tax parcel and the MLS number and the address. Good work. Remember that we wanted to. I always attached the legal description, so you guys all did that exactly the way you should have by checking the box in B1 saying the legal description is attached. Okay, we'll get to how we label that here soon. Next, purchase price, we all put it there properly, okay? Yeah, all that was done exactly right. Contribution, seller's contribution to closing costs. Let's review this for a second. The way that both parties are gonna have closing costs, okay? The seller's closing costs are largely the agent commissions, right? and they're going to have a little wire fee to pay off their mortgage if there's a mortgage, okay? And they're going to have to deal with any prorations. And I don't want to get bogged down with this, but basically for every day they've owned the property, they will pay taxes for that day. So for example, let's say the deal closes today, then the seller has not paid any of the taxes for 2020 yet they've owned the home for half of the year or a little less than half of the year. So when the tax bill comes, the buyer is going to pay the full tax amount. So in order to make the buyer whole, they're going to write a check for the prorated number of days that they've owned a home. Not write a check, but they're going to be debited at closing for that amount of money. That way, when the buyer or when the tax bill is ultimately due, the buyer will have enough money and they have been made whole by the previous owner. Okay, so what that means, and they're going to do that for HOA dues as well. So if there's HOA dues for this particular property, they're going to do that. Now, they're going to pay for the exact number of days that they own the property and not for any of the days they do not own the property. Okay. Now, let's see. Okay, so closing costs for the seller are going to be commissions and, oh, I'm sorry. So meanwhile, the seller, who may not even realize that they were going to sell the home later on in the year, has been making escrow deposits with their mortgage payment, right? So they've been building up the amount of money in their escrow account. And then all of a sudden the bank or the mortgage holder is going to get all their money, right? So the home's going to sell, that they're going to pay off the mortgage, and then the escrow account holder is going to say, well, I don't need this money anymore, and they rebate it to the seller. But the seller, and usually that takes place within about 30 days. However, the seller is going to have to come out of pocket for that proration. Okay, so you'll need to know these things as you're creating a net sheet for your seller, so they can anticipate, you know, if I accept the offer at 310, how much money am I going to walk away from the closing table with? Okay, so we can do a session later on net sheets, but those are essentially the seller closing costs. Now the buyer closing costs are every fee that is associated with buying the home and every fee that is associated with getting the money to buy the home. Okay, so that's everything from title search to establishment of the escrow accounts to paying the lender to title insurance, lender's insurance, owner's insurance, all that kind of stuff. And when you get a pre-approved or a loan worksheet from the lender, it'll itemize all of those fees. So basically, the closing costs for a buyer are going to be dependent on the amount of money that they're borrowing, the type of loan that they're getting, right? And it could also be credit sensitive as well. So there is no like the closing costs are always this, and we don't want to say the seller is going to quote pay closing costs. We would say they're going to pay X number of dollars towards the closing cost, right? Because in some examples, the closing cost could be a few $1,000s. And in some examples, the closing cost could be 10 grand, okay? A very generalized rule of thumb, you're probably looking at somewhere between 2 and 3%, okay? Somewhere in the 2 to 3% neighborhood. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take that loan worksheet from the buyer and from the buyer's lender, look to see how much the closing costs are, and see if the buyer is prepared to pay those, or if we need to ask the seller for those contributions. So there are some examples here where it was either left blank. We definitely don't want to leave anything blank, okay? Or we put in a number that may or may not be enough. What we don't want to do is surprise the buyer by only asking for, let's say, 3,500 when they need 6,500. Make sense? Now, of course, I didn't give you that information, so you've done good. There was one person that just didn't put anything there. Just never leave it blank. Either put 0 or an NA or a dash or something, okay? All right, next. Closing. Looks like we have July 9th, July 13th, July 10th, July 6th, July 9th. Very good. What we want to do is make sure that the lender has enough time to close. Generally speaking, that's about 30 to 35 days. Okay, so every answer you guys gave is phenomenal there. Okay, very few exceptions. We want to exchange possession at closing. Looks like there was one person that did not check at closing. Again, don't leave anything blank. Okay. Okay, next. If there is, by the way, if there's some issue with like the seller wants to close on this day and then box everything up and they want the weekend to move out. That's something called a temporary occupancy agreement. I'm not crazy about those, and the lenders generally are not crazy about those, but it does happen every once in a while. So we can talk offline about how that works. But by far and away, the most popular and most common way to do it is for the keys to be exchanged at the closing table. Okay. Okay, next, holder of the earnest money. Looks like everybody, there was one person that left it blank. Ideally, you would have our brokerage in there. Okay. Somebody put Keller or O'Kelly and Sorahan. I would recommend that you put Keller Williams Realty Consultants in there. Okay. If there is any arbitration or any issue, then where the earnest money goes is often decided by who holds the earnest money. Not that one brokerage would like blatantly interpret the contract incorrectly. It's just if you have control over that, I'd rather it be in Melba's hands. Okay. Now, if I'm on the listing side and I receive an offer and they have their brokerage as the earnest money holder, that's not generally something I'm going to fight too hard on. Okay. I'd more often than not, I'd rather have better terms for my client than decide who holds the earnest money. Make sense? Okay. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is law firm. So the law firm is where you would put O'Kelly and Sorahan. And oftentimes somebody had put Kern's name with a telephone number. That's great. Somebody left it blank. Don't ever leave it blank. You could also put like Alpharetta office or something like that. So O'Kelly's got like 30 offices around the city. You want to make sure that they know which one you're talking about. Okay. Okay. Next, earnest money. Earnest money, you are able to either bring in a check, right? When you bring in a check, we have an envelope system where you fill out like who the binding agreement date is and who all the buyer and seller is and the property address and all of that. We make a copy of it and you can send that off to the other party, letting them know that the earnest money has been received. The earnest money has been received. Okay. You can also wire it in. We're dealing with a wire issue right now, not an issue, but buyer is out of town, so they're going to wire the money in. Okay, and Lee or Aaron can give you wiring instructions to have it wired in. Okay, and then we can get you the receipt and all that so you can furnish to the other party. Make sure you check how it's going to be delivered. So whether it's check or wiring instructions, there's no wrong or right answer. But again, one person that looks like left it blank, we don't want to leave it blank. Okay, next. How much do we give? Okay, earnest money in there's two rules of thumb kind of. If I'm on the buyer side, I want as little as possible. If I'm on the seller side, I want as much as possible. Make sense? Earnest money is the amount of money that will be lost, if you will, if they violate the contract and the seller chooses the earnest money over a lawsuit. Okay. So it's not necessarily the case that they would, quote, lose their earnest money and that's all that could happen. Okay. The seller does have the opportunity to not take the earnest money and instead sue. Okay. So it's not just that they risk a few $1,000s and that's all they could lose if they totally violate the contract. Okay. So the buyer's maximum exposure is not the amount of earnest money. It could be more than that. And it could be very, very ugly. Okay. Generally speaking, knowing that the buyer wants as little as possible and the seller wants as much as possible, what we generally find in the market is that it's around 1%. Okay. It is negotiable, but it generally is around 1%. Okay. So we have somebody that did exactly 1%, somebody that did a little less than 1%, which is okay. Just put it out there. We're creating our perfect scenario. If they want more money, they can ask for more money. Okay. Somebody else put a little bit more than 1%. That's fine. We have somebody that put close to 3%. It's way more than is necessary. And again, somebody else that put $10,000. That's just too much. I wouldn't feel comfortable putting that much money on the line. Now, if I'm in a competitive situation, I may encourage my buyer to put a little bit more money out there to show how serious I am. Make sense? So there's one attitude that I would bring to the table if I was negotiating a loan. There's a different attitude that I would bring to the table if I am in a competitive situation. Make sense? Okay, let's talk about due diligence period. Due diligence period is next. Okay, 10 days, 11 days, 14 days, 14 days, 10 days, all great. I would say you're probably gonna more often than not be in that 10-day neighborhood, okay? You do wanna have a dialogue with your home inspector as things are getting a little closer to going under contract, right? Back a couple of years ago, when it was crazy out there with multiple offers and all that stuff, as I would submit an offer, I'd call my inspector and say, hey, I'm close. What you got? I say, hey, save me the Thursday at 3 o'clock. I'll let you know in an hour if we're binding, right? It was that kind of thing, because if I didn't get it right away, I might have to wait a week for a home inspection, right? So you guys all did great there. You just want to make sure that you have an ongoing relationship with a home inspector to understand, you know, are things booking up really quickly? Are things taking a little bit longer than usual? That kind of stuff, okay? Especially around COVID, where people's timeframes may be different and all that stuff, okay? And who might be willing to work might be different, all right? So good job on that. Again, that's a number where the buyer ideally would love as many days as possible, and the seller would like as few days as possible. But what you generally see as a compromise, if you will, is around 10 days, okay? Should we spend a minute on what the due diligence period is? Okay, we'll move on then. Everyone cool? If the buyer is not satisfied with the property under the current terms of the agreement, as that due diligence period is expiring, they need to leave the deal. Okay. Even if they submit an amendment to address concerns and it does not get addressed like they want it to get addressed, and the buyer therefore is not interested in moving forward with those terms, then they need to leave the deal, right? The seller does not have a due diligence period. The seller cannot get a request for inspection, repairs, and all that stuff and say, hey, I hate you. I'm out of the contract. They can't do that. Now they can say no, right? And they can not budge on anything, no matter how big or small it is, but only the buyer is the one that can leave the contract. Make sense? All right, next. Lead-based paint. This home was not built prior to 1978, so you don't have to worry about lead-based paint. A couple of us checked the box that says not built prior to 1978. We have a few that left it blank. Make sure, again, don't leave anything blank. All right, next, brokerage relationship. Now, we happened to pick somebody that was in our office. This was not a trick or anything like that. But if you were working with anyone at Keller Williams Realty Consultants, the Roswell Market Center, not any other KW, that is what's called designated agency, okay? Disclosed designated agency, which means, let's say that Kim is the buyer's agent and Bill is the listing agent. We have the same broker, okay? So it is allowed, there's no issue there. And even though we might be friends, don't forget who you represent, right? Don't show everyone your cards, right? Or Kim, I'm not going to show Kim my cards, right? And she shouldn't show me hers, right? But it does need to be disclosed. So in this exact scenario, what we should have is Keller Williams Realty Consultants is the selling broker and the listing broker. The selling broker represents the buyer as a client, and a check here that says, Donna was real close on how she did this correctly. Ebony was too, but you need to check number 4 that says is acting as a designated agent, and is acting as the designated agent representing the seller. Okay, essentially what that means is that Aubrey has designated me to work with the seller and designated Kim to work with the buyer, if that makes sense. Dual agency is when the same agent represents both parties, okay? The state of Georgia does allow that. Our office policy has been to allow that only with approval of the team leader. And the way that you're gonna get that approval is by proving to the team leader, you know how to explain what you can and can't do, okay?
So Bill, you have to check number 1 and number 4.
That's correct.
Is that what you said? Okay.
That's correct. Now, let's assume the listing was a non-Keller Williams Realty Consultants agent, okay? Then 10A1 should be checked, right? And 10B1 should be checked, but no other should be checked, and you don't need to put anything in the lines under designated agent, because there is no designated agent because you don't have the same broker. Make sense? That would also be the case if you're at 2 separate KW offices. because each office is individually owned and operated. All right, any questions thus far? Okay, time limit, very bottom of the page. Time limit, I think you should, there's strategy involved either way, okay? I think an appropriate amount of time to respond to an offer is about 24 hours, okay? If I want to put the seller under a little bit of pressure for a variety of reasons, then I may shorten that time period, right? If I know that multiple offers are going to be evaluated in 3 days, then I'll extend it, okay? I also, from a bit of a selfish standpoint, want to put a time period on there that works with my life, right? I don't really want to do it 8 p.m. on Saturday night deadline. I don't really want to be dealing with this at Saturday night at 8 p.m. Does that make sense? I'd rather deal with it at 1 o'clock Sunday or 1 o'clock Monday. Make sense? So don't put yourself in, we end up putting ourselves in a lot of the stress that we create by these kind of deadlines, okay? You also don't want to go out too far because that could leave the door open for them to go solicit offers from other parties, and now all of a sudden you got to deal with multiple offers. Make sense?
Okay, so I have a question. It
Yep.
does. So when we are pretty much submitting an offer, it does not have to be the same time offer as the due diligence. So we literally want to shorten that up to at least 1 day, but in the part where it says due diligence, we can keep that at, I guess, anywhere from 10 to 14 days?
Two totally separate issues. One is how long is this offer valid for? That's what you put at the bottom. That's the time limit in which this offer as written can be accepted.
Okay.
Once it's accepted, even if it's gone some counter offering, when it is accepted, that is the binding agreement date. The next day is day one of the due diligence time period. Totally separate.
Okay.
Follow that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Do not forget, there is a buyer section and a seller section down below for them to initial. Okay. No one initialed those. So make sure that when you are, it's not just the signature page on the last page of the contract, they also have to initial down here. Okay. If their formal name has a, if it's Andrew Tyler Brooks, they need to sign Andrew Tyler Brooks or initial ATB. Okay. All right. The next pages, page 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, are all basically explaining a lot of what I just explained. If you have not read those paragraphs, that is critical that you read them because you may be and likely will be asked to explain some of this stuff. Okay. Now, I want to kind of hammer one point home earlier about closing costs. So the contract here, the way that it reads is it says that the buyer will pay all closing costs, all of the buyer's closing costs. And that's all the fees that are associated with buying the home and obtaining financing to buy the home. And the next sentence says, and the seller will pay X number of dollars towards those closing costs. So it's not uncommon for the seller to both have to pay their closing costs and a portion of the buyer's closing costs. When I just sold my home, I paid my closing cost, which happened to be one commission, obviously, instead of two. But I also agreed to pay over $12,000 to the buyer's closing cost. So my net worth went down 25 grand to sell my home. Make sense? Okay. Next. I know this was a bit confusing the way I asked you to do it, and I apologize for that. And Heather, I hope you understood what I had said earlier. But what I wanted you to do was, this is on page 7 of the purchase and sale agreement. See right here how it has all these possible documents that could be included in the offer? What I want you to do is you want to say community association and label it. Let's say C. And then when you get the community association disclosure, you label that C, right? Next, conventional loan exhibit. It doesn't matter what you name them, but don't name multiple things A, right? So conventional loan exhibit is A, and on the conventional loan exhibit, it should say A, okay? Legal description D, that's great. When you get the legal description, type in exhibit D, and have them initial that legal description, okay? So my intention was not for you all to call Trace and ask for the disclosures. It was simply to check off the docs that were included and label them. So we had some people check them but didn't label them, and then some people didn't check them. So we want to make sure that all documents that are considered part of the offer are checked on here and they're labeled, and the label matches what's actually on that page. Make sense? But so a legal description, for example, is not going to have a space like, you know, your loan exhibit here. It says exhibit blank, right? It prompts you. A legal description is not going to have that, so you gotta type it in yourself. Make sense? All right, cool. And then we had some space here for stipulations. Many of us left the stipulations blank, and there was one person who wrote what all the exhibits were. So that's not necessary because that's what you do up just above that, okay? Follow what I'm saying? You don't have to say exhibit A conventional, exhibit B pre-approval. That's exactly what you're doing up here, okay? Okay, so some standard kind of stipulations that I would always encourage you to make sure that you're considering are, do I want to ask for a home warranty? Do I have all the HOA documents and have I reviewed them, or has the buyer reviewed them really, right? And by the way, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that the buyer understands what is, perhaps what you might call unusual, right? So if the HOA documents say, hey, you can't fly an Auburn flag outside, then I want to make sure the buyer knows that I don't usually see that, and that's something that they may, you know, let's say they have an Auburn flag at their own home and they're buying a home that has a restriction against that, not Auburn, but a flag, then I want to make sure they know that, right? If, for example, they, let's see, can't, you know, have to put up a fence made of a certain material, right? You can't put like a chain link fence in a lot of neighborhoods. You have to put up a wooden fence, right? So I just want to point out to them stuff. Now, is that my job? Debatable. Do I want them to try to put up a chain link fence and then yell at me in 6 months? No, absolutely not. So I'm going to read their docs too, and I'm going to tell them what I think of them. Make sense? All right. The COVID stip, great job, Donna, for putting that in. And every once in a while, if I haven't gotten the HOA documents, I'm going to put in there seller to furnish the HOA documents or seller to furnish the seller's disclosure statement, that kind of stuff. Okay.
Bill, quick question.
Yeah.
So 2 things. On the exhibits for surveys, should we not have our clients tell them they should get surveys on properties, or? Good
question. The vast majority of buyers, in my experience, do not get surveys. 100% of the time, though, you need to put in writing, I recommend a survey. Okay. Then it's up to them to determine if they're going to get a survey. Okay. 100% of the time, you need to tell them it's smart. Okay. Now, I would hammer that hard, even harder, if it was an older property, or if it was a property that goes up towards like a creek or a lake or something like that, or power lines, or it's a large amount of acreage, right? I would recommend it anyway. But those are some situations oftentimes, or where there's been additions that have been done, where the survey might identify problems that they should be aware of during the due diligence period. Because if something is revealed in the due diligence period that makes them not want to buy the home, they need to know about that. I'll give you an example. I have I think I told this story the other day. I had a buyer bought a home in Decatur, and if you know, over near North Druid Hills area, there's some power towers over there, right? And underneath the power towers, there's what essentially my guy looked at as running trails, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, this is paradise," right? But his backyard backed up to one. And I said to him, I said, "Hey, you see that, right?" He's like, "Yeah, man, look at all these running trails." I'm like, "You sure?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Okay, let's get a survey." Because what we needed to do is, they have an easement that prevents, the county has an easement that prevents you from building out until a certain space, right? So you don't have the ability to build right up next to the or right up next to the tower. They restrict that. There's a buffer, right? So what he was talking about was adding a deck to the house, and he was also talking about adding to the house, like a full renovation, like knocking down a wall and building an extra room. When we got a survey, what we identified is that there basically was not going to be enough room to do both. So he was either going to be able to do a really nice addition or a really nice deck, but he wasn't going to be able to do both, right? Because he would have gotten too close to the power tower. Now, if that's going to prevent him from wanting to buy that home, he needs to know about that during the due diligence period. If he doesn't care, he doesn't care. Does that make sense? That's the type of value we bring to the transaction. Okay. There's a square at the very bottom of the page that says additional special stipulations are attached. There was one person who checked that. Do not want to check that if there's no stipulations attached. Okay. More often than not, I mean, you're probably not going to have that many stipulations, but if it is, check it and have an additional page. There's a document called additional page as a GAR form, and title it what it is and keep going. But if you don't have any additional stipulations, don't check the box. Make sense? All right, let's go to the signature page. It is my personal opinion, I think Melba would agree with me, and if she doesn't, I'd be happy to debate her. I don't believe you should give any personal information of the buyer. Okay, I don't want them to know where my buyer lives. I don't want them to know how to reach my buyer by email, and I don't want them to know how to reach my buyer by phone. Make sense? So just put the buyer's name. Okay, leave the rest blank. I do not want the listing agent or the seller contacting my buyer without me being there. I don't want it to happen at all. I'm the middleman. That's what I'm being paid to do. My buyer has not been trained in negotiation, likely, and my buyer does not know how to handle the details of real estate transaction, and I do, and I don't want them being taken advantage of. Make sense? Now, in the buyer brokerage agreement, I do need that because that's just private information between the two of us. Remember, we're not sharing the buyer brokerage agreement with the other party. Make sense? Okay. So the vast majority of us gave some contact information. My recommendation is not to do that. Okay. Now the page
and that was on the purchase and sale agreement, or which one was that?
I'm on the signature page of the purchase and sale agreement right now.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Don't add their phone number or any of the buyer's contact info.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Okay. Everything else you guys did a pretty good job on. Making sure you fill out the listing broker's information. There's a few people that left a few things blank. Fill out as much as you can. Like you may not know, for example, what board the other agent is a part of. You could ask them, or you could just leave it blank. But the vast majority of the time, that information is on, with the exception of the board, is on the listing itself. Okay, so you can see like what their broker code is, what their email address is, what their fax number is, what their cell phone number is, that kind of thing. Okay, what their broker's address is, and make sure you complete it as much as possible for yourself. So there's like a couple people that didn't put their license number or didn't put what board of realtors they were part of. Make sure you complete that as much as you possibly can. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, last thing on the purchase and sale agreement is we had a few people put the binding agreement date. We don't know if it's not binding yet. It's simply an offer at this stage. Okay, so we submit an offer, and one of three things is going to happen. They're going to call me up and say, Bill, you nuts, try again, right? Or, which probably isn't going to happen that often, or they're going to counter it, or they're going to accept it. Okay, when it is accepted, let's say the buyer is the party that accepts the final terms, then they're going to fill in they're going to send off the contract fully executed, right? Or the counter offer fully executed back to the other party, and the other party will fill in the binding agreement date. Okay, binding agreement date is the date that both parties agreed. Day one is the following day for the purposes of all the counting. Okay, so if we go binding on a Sunday, Monday is day one. And all the days include federal holidays, they include weekends, they include everything. They include all days, okay? Okay, so when you're submitting an offer, that should be blank. The binding agreement date should be blank. Okay, does anyone have any questions on the purchase and sale part of the contract?
Yeah, I have a question about, so for the special stipulations, I know when I did this before, there was something where you could pull commonly used special stipulations and you would just like cut and paste or something that had like legal verbiage. And do you know where I could get that? Is that a thing anymore?
It is definitely a thing. That used to auto-populate in the forms. Does that not do it anymore?
I couldn't find it, but maybe it's there and I don't know. I couldn't figure out how to get to that.
Okay.
They're still updating the forms that they're putting in for the office that are branded to the office. So once those are in, from my understanding from watching some of the sessions, then we'll have easier access to that. Because like if when you go down, you chose whether you want it from DocuSign or somewhere else, and like you had the Keller Williams thing, in the Keller Williams area, you had very, very small selection of items and never what we needed. They're just not populated yet because they're still creating it all for DocuSign. So they're doing it one office at a time.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
The short and sweet of that is if you need, thank you, Heather, if you need some specific verbiage on the warranty one or some other one, then just ask for it and we'll get it to you right away. Okay. All right. Do you guys, is this helpful the way I've gone through the contract? Is this the way that makes the most sense to you guys?
Yes.
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 All right, let's move on to the convention.
I have one more question before we get there. When at the bottom where it says the brokerage firm license number and the MLS office code.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm looking at my parking card. I want to fill it out, you know, just so I can have it.
Yep.
I see the broker. So is the broker code and the broker's firm license number, is that the same thing or?
Yeah, the office code is KWRO01 and the brokerage license number is H as in Harry
460.
6087.
Okay, I put it in the wrong place.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the conventional loan exhibit. Again, there is no necessarily order to which exhibits are like A, B, C, D, and F. Just make sure they match. Okay, don't have like 2 C's or something. Okay, and don't say that the FHA or the conventional loan exhibit on the contract is B, but then on the agreement itself it's D. Make sure they match. Okay. Agents like working with agents that have tight contracts, right? Where things aren't, where everything that's supposed to be checked is checked, everything that's not supposed to be checked is not checked, right? So one of the skills that you're going to develop over time is being great at contracts, right? And being able to answer questions and explain them and quickly write them and quickly negotiate them. And you guys are, I think this is a perfect format to learn, okay? All right, conventional loan exhibit. Make sure that the offer date of the contract matches the offer date of any exhibits, okay? So you guys, looks like there was one person that put like June 1st. So make sure that that was, I don't know if that's a typo or not, but make sure you're putting the date that you're submitting the offer or that you're writing the offer, okay? The full address. Okay, section 1. Now, we want to make sure that we check first mortgage. What we discussed was that the borrower was going to put 10% down and borrow 90%. So they're going to get a 90% loan. Almost everyone got that right, okay? So they're going to be obtaining financing for 90% of the mortgage. So that's what goes under loan amount, 90% of the loan, 10% is the down payment. Okay, they're not getting a second loan for the 10%. Looks like one person did that. They're just getting, they're using cash for that. That's their down payment. Okay, so the correct way to do it would be to check box A, put 90%, and leave this part blank. Okay, there are some, particularly in the higher loan amount areas, where you could do like you get the first loan for 80%, you get the second loan for 10%, and then you put down 10%. So there are some kind of unique financing opportunities, but for the one we laid out, it was 90% loan, 10% down payment. So only the first block should be filled out. All right, next is term, 30 years, okay, unless your borrower is getting something different, okay. All right, next block, I kind of have, maybe I'm a little anxious about this, but I kind of have a way that I like doing this, which is I did not put the prevailing interest rate. If I was the buyer, if I was the buyer's agent, I would put a little bit higher, just a hair higher than the interest rate, okay? If I'm on the seller side, I don't want that at all. I want it to read market. So what the purpose of this document is can the buyer, over the course of however long it is, let's say it's 21 days, can the buyer get rejected for this mortgage and get out of the deal without losing any earnest money? Okay, that's essentially what the purpose of this document is. Okay, so rejected for this mortgage could mean, let's say that today when I'm writing the offer, the interest rate is 3.75 and my buyer can afford it. And then in the next 3 weeks, something crazy happens and now the rate is 4, now my buyer can't afford it. Make sense? Because they're right on the edge or something like that. So I don't want there to ever be a situation as a seller or as a seller's agent, listing agent, that I get that phone call that says, hey, I don't know if you saw it, but the rates, jumped up a tiny bit and now my buyer can't buy. Hell no. That thing's saying market. So if the market jumps, that's your problem. Okay, you either borrow the money, figure out how to make the thing close, or I'm taking the earnest money. Okay, I'm not trying to sound raw here. When I'm protecting the seller, I'm protecting the seller. When I'm protecting the buyer, I'm protecting the buyer. Okay, so you guys were all representing the buyer, so pretty good job here. What this means is that, let's say Donna, for example, said 3.13. Most likely that's what she was quoted. Now, if that interest rate goes to 3.25, then she could theoretically say, hey, 3.25, my guy can't qualify anymore, and she would have the ability to get out of the contract. As a seller, I don't want that happening. So if I'm on the seller side, I'd like for this to read market. That basically says whatever it is whatever it is. You're buying the home. On the buyer side, it should be probably right what you're quoted or a hair higher. Does that make sense? Okay, definitely don't want to leave it blank. There's one or two people that left it blank. Okay.
Why would you go a little higher if you want the ability to get out, or is it something like?
That's a really good question. I guess the straight answer to that is you're right, and it should probably just be whatever the rate is. The rate, by the way, can fluctuate based on closing costs. So you could go you could go to Kathy and say, hey, I want to rate it 2.5. She says, cool, your closing costs can be 30 grand, but I can do 2.5, no problem, right? So closing cost and interest rate go in opposite directions, okay? If you're gonna get what's called a par quote, that means that that's the prevailing rate with your normal, no points or anything like that, and you have your normal closing cost. If you're in a situation where you need to, let's say, reduce your closing costs to make your offer more attractive in a multiple offer situation, so instead of asking for $7,500, you want to ask for $2,500, and you may go back to the lender and say, hey, can you adjust the interest rate a little bit so that we can have to pay less closing costs so we can win this thing, right? Because if you don't win, then no point in talking about anything else. Make sense? And they pay a little bit more on the mortgage interest rate, but at the end of the day, they got the house that they were looking for. Make sense? So Heather, to directly answer your question, that's a great point. If you're quoted 3.5, just write 3.5. But don't be surprised if they come back and say, hey, we need to bump it up a slight bit. Make sense?
Okay, so would you be able to put like the amount that you were quoted or points difference, or like have some kind of thing in there with giving that option for buying points if that came down to it, to show flexibility? Because if it's still kind of keeping the client qualified under that amount that they're approved for, like I don't want to change the pre-approval and be wrong.
So if, for example, the rate was, this is not what your client is getting. right? This is, or is going to choose to receive. This is under what circumstances could they use this contingency to leave the deal. So for
Right.
example, let's say it reads 3.5, but in order for them to, you know, lower the closing costs, they got to go to 4. Even that, they don't have to leave the contract because they went higher than this.
Right, but I'm saying to protect the client, like if I put a higher interest rate, but they don't qualify for that interest rate, I don't want to have the client not get their money back because of me. Or am I not understanding this correctly?
No, that's a fair way to put it, and that's why you don't want to go, you don't want to have too much gap between what you put and what you're quoted. Right. Does that make sense? So go back to what you're originally saying, which is just keep it real close to what they're quoted if you're on the buyer's side.
Okay.
Okay. I think I was like the only agent in town that did this because like I had to explain it so many times to other agents. I was like, just put market there.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
I'm not signing the contract until you put market there. So if you want this place, put it there. Jonathan, did you have a question? I just saw your hand up. I don't know how long that's been there.
No, I just put it up. Hey, Bill, I've always took the practice of putting it up just like 1/4%. So if it's, you know, 3.5, go to like 3.75.
I think
Just
that's
in case it goes up. But typically a good lender will lock their rate in for like 60 to 90 days, correct?
exactly. 90 days a little high, probably more like 45 to 60 days. Yeah.
so if you're going to bump it up a little bit, do you get client permission?
No, I just put it on there a little bit higher just in case the market changes and it goes up. Because if it goes down, that's better for them. But
Right.
you want to give them the leeway of, you know, if it goes up too high, they can back out. But there's still flexibility if it goes up 0.5%, which it might. That's still a good rate for them, and they have the option to take it.
So I hear what you're saying, Heather, which is you get client permission. I would just, when you're writing the offer, you're explaining this to them. So say, look, the seller is going to want you to say like, hey, I don't care what the rate is, you're going to continue to buy the home and you're not going to be protected, right? And ideally, you want to be as low as possible. So what we generally put here is either what you're quoted or 1/4% higher than what you're quoted, just both sides in agreement on it. Okay.
Okay.
So as long as
And when it comes right down to it, the buyer has to initial that anyway, so they've approved it.
yeah, but I'll tell you what, right now, the vast majority of your buyers are not going to read the paperwork. And the vast majority of your sellers are not going to read the paperwork. And that's why you need to be able to explain to them what they're agreeing to.
Right.
Okay, next is rate type. Conventional loan, it's not always fixed, but I should have spelled this out, but you guys all did the right thing. Go ahead and check fixed. If it's fixed, most of the time it is fixed. But if one of your borrowers or buyers is doing an adjustable rate mortgage or an interest only mortgage, then you check the appropriate box. Don't leave it blank.
Can we go back just a little bit?
Sure.
Just on where the interest rate is, pretty much when we get the pre-approval is where we know what the interest rate would be. Like how did everybody know what number to come up with? But it was kind of just
exactly
like up in there. Okay.
That's exactly right. Okay, and then source of the loan, the vast majority of the time it's going to be institutional. If they happen to be getting a, like if they're asking for seller financing, then you would check seller, or if they're getting hard money, then you would check other and explain it. Hard money is essentially unconventional financing where they go through their own underwriting standards. Hard money is used a lot in reconstruction loans, and if somebody wants to come across as a cash borrower, then they can go and obtain financing from a secondary source and come in and be a cash borrower. However, because there's more risk involved, it's a good bit more expensive, meaning it's got a higher interest rate. Okay, section 2. This is not where you put who the lender is going to be. Okay, this is who the lender is going to be. You don't have to make that decision at this moment. Okay, because the buyer may want to quote shop the loan, right? So they may want to go to Kathy and then go to somebody else and go to somebody else to make sure they're getting the best terms. Okay, if they decide to do that, make sure your buyer is actually comparing apples to apples. Okay, a lot of times you got to look at not just the interest rate and closing cost, and you got to make sure the closing costs are don't make one person quote closing cost at taxes that are $4,000 a year and somebody else quote closing cost at a rate of $6,000 a year in taxes, or the numbers aren't going to be, they're not going to be comparing apples to apples. Okay. So the pre-approval letter that you include with the contract, that's basically stating this borrower is serious about the process and they've spent time with this particular lender, and this particular lender says they're good to go. Okay. However, if you put a mortgage broker or mortgage officer in this blank, your rejection letter has to come from that person. So from a buyer standpoint, you're better off leaving that blank. Okay. So my recommendation, again, leave it blank. That way your borrower can go to anybody they want to go to, and they can get a rejection letter from anyone they want to go to. Make sense? All right, beautiful. Next, section 5, financing contingency. So we have 3 time periods moving at all at the same time. Okay, you have a binding agreement date. Generally speaking, you're going to have, let's call it 10 days of due diligence, where you can get out of the deal for any reason. Let's just say you're going to have 21 days of financing contingency and 21 days of an appraisal contingency. They're all the same days. They're all running simultaneously. Okay. Now, remember, once the deal goes binding, you're going to send the paperwork to the attorney. So they're going to start the title work and all that. You're going to send the paperwork to the lender, and they're going to get the financing file together. They're going to ask your borrower for their, pay stubs and their retirement accounts and their credit pull, and they're going to proof of income, and if they're getting child support or they're paying child support, they're going to basically run the buyer through the gamut to make sure that this person has a history of paying their debts on time and has the financial wherewithal to pay their debts. Makes sense? And that's what the underwriting process is. That generally lasts around 3 to 4 weeks. That's why it takes a month or so to close. Okay, so many of you put down 21 days. Somebody put NA. We definitely don't want to put NA. 14 days. Somebody put 14 days. That's pretty tight. I might do 14 days if I had a conversation with the lender and said, hey, I want every part of this contract to look phenomenal. How fast can you underwrite this file? 14 days, normally speaking, is pretty tight though. I would prefer to see this somewhere in the 21 to 25 day neighborhood. Okay. Now, what that means is that if the buyer or if the borrower obtains a rejection letter within that number of days, they can get out of the deal without the loss of their earnest money. The fine print here says that it can't be essentially self-sabotage, and it can't be based on like a lack of communication, right? So for example, let's say you decide after the due diligence period that the buyer doesn't want to buy the home, and all of a sudden they go rent a BMW or lease a Lexus, and now their ratios are off, and then they go to their lender and say, hey, I can't afford the home anymore. They're going to lose their earnest money. Okay, can't do that. Can't be self-sabotage. When somebody is buying a home, you need to have a real blunt conversation with them. Ebony, you clear? You're my buyer. No cash deposits without lender approval. Understand? No new credit accounts. I don't care if Kohl's is offering 10% off if you sign up for a credit card. Okay? You need to be on your best behavior. No new credit accounts. No new cash deposits that cannot be explained without the permission of your lender. Okay? And no new toys until this house is bought. Make sense? I don't want you going to Bed Bath & Beyond and buying all your furniture on a credit card before this deal closes, or you may be living in your furniture. Okay? If you're going to spend anything unusual, ask your lender first or ask me first. Make sense?
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Why would it matter if you deposit cash into your account?
Oh my gosh, man. They just want to make sure that, for example, it's not going to ultimately be like the source of a down payment that's unexplained, or that something fishy is going on. I know it sounds ridiculous. If you were to deposit, $20 in, I don't think it'd be a problem, but you just want to add, a rule of thumb is just don't do it. But before you do it, you need to call the lender and say, hey, it was my birthday. I got $600 in cash. Can I deposit this? And more than likely, they're going to tell you don't do it. they'll probably tell you to go spend it on gas or groceries or use that money instead of your credit card until the money's gone. Okay. I know it sounds crazy. I remember a story. This is back when the market, 10, 12 years ago, when the market was terrible. And my client buying a home, about a $350,000 home in Cumming, and he pulled $5,000. He had a CD for $5,000, pulled it out, and he stuck the money under his mattress, literally. Okay. And then 4 or 5 months later, when he had a little bit more confidence in the market, he went and deposited the money. And again, there was completely different guidelines at that time. But the lender said, "Hey, where'd this money come from?" And he's like, "Oh, it's this CD. Here's all the statements on it, and here's you know, when I took it out and when I put it back." And they're like, "We have to wait another month to close because you can't have that. That's not a good enough explanation." And my guy called me. He's like, "Dude, what's wrong with this?" I said, "Look, first of all, this is the money side of the transaction. It's got nothing to do with me. But let me tell you something. You, my friend, are about to buy a $350,000 house, and you're putting up 35 grand. Okay, 10%. The other 90% is not your money. Okay, so think about this. All the due diligence that you're doing with a home inspection and a radon inspection and studying of the comps and all that kind of stuff, you're putting the bank is putting 9 times the amount of risk out there. Okay, the bank's going to want to do some research too. And if they don't like what they see, they're not going to give you the money." I said, "So do you want the money or do you not want the money? Because the person with the money makes the rules. And if you don't like the rules, tough shit. You don't get the money. Now what do you want to do?" Excuse me, but I mean, it's really that simple. Like, if you want the money, follow the rules. If you don't like the rules, then go get somebody else's money. Does that make sense?
It does, but what if that CD, that $5,000 was gonna be used as a part of the 10%? Like, I'm getting confused on where the source of the money should come from.
Yeah, it's challenging sometimes. And that's why you just need to go to the lender and explain to them what's going on. Again, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. Literally, a borrower is going to feel like they're going to be asked for a urine sample by the time this thing's done. Okay.
Well, aren't you allowed to bring cashier's checks to closings?
Not anymore. They're going to want wire.
Yeah. Okay, so it actually does have to be in the account. So
yeah.
No cashier's check anymore.
No.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to want all receivables need to be wire sent. Now, I'm saying, like, if you're expected to prepare at the very end to bring the money in, right? And there's a clear communication with where it was. This was different. This was money that was not in an account being now put into account. What you're suggesting is transferring money from one verifiable account to another verifiable account.
So when you get, also wire would go right to the lawyers as you're
Yes.
earning money or your.
Yes. Okay.
Well, the
Now,
reason I was asking that about the cashier's check is because if you could bring that, you can just bring the cash to the bank and get cashier's check without depositing funds. But if you can't bring one, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, good point. Exactly. Okay, so not to freak you guys out about this, but there's also a lot of wire fraud. Okay. So there are, malware that somebody could get into your email and see that you communicate about purchasing real estate, and they check your email and they know the closing is going to be at this day and they're expecting the wire, and then they send your buyer the fake wiring instructions, right? And they're out hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay. The wiring instructions need to be, they're going to be encrypted most likely, and they're going to come from the lender. Okay. Anything short of that needs to be double checked. Okay. Now, financing contingency, I would usually have 21 days to 25 days in there. Okay. There is a good likelihood that that loan is not going to be fully underwritten during that time period. By the way, in a perfect scenario, that period would last the entire term of the, that would take you up until closing, right? That's what the buyer would prefer. If I lose my job the day before closing, I get my earnest money back. The seller doesn't want to do that because they don't want to show up at day before closing and all of a sudden their buyer just lost their job and they can't collect the earnest money, right? So 21 to 25 days is generally that middle ground. There's a good chance though, that loan is not going to be fully underwritten by that time, but it should have a preliminary approval. And the preliminary approval would be like, hey, all we need is their last check stub, or hey, all we need is, you know, an explanation of where this money came from or something like that. So it's what's called a conditional approval. If the conditions are simple, right, then we're good to go. If the conditions are a little complex and they may not work perfectly, that lender better hustle, because I need to know if this buyer is going to be able to buy this home, so we protect their earnest money. That's why there's got to be so much communication with the lender, okay? And if you're working with a lender that is you're not used to working with, they need to understand that they can't screw this up, okay? There's a lot of we're the choreographer of all the different vendors that are involved in the process, and the buck stops here, okay? I've had relationships with lenders before where I courted, or the buyer brought a lender and the lender was a goofball. And they kept not doing what they were supposed to do. They didn't answer the phone enough. You know, it was hard to get a hold of them. And I straight up called my buyer and said, look, your guy's a goofball. Okay, if you don't straighten this up, something's gonna happen. Okay, I don't want a C player on our team. I want A players. Can we get an A player, please?
Deny it. Do it.
What?
That's good.
Does that make sense? All right, appraisal contingency. On a conventional loan, you get a separate, it is a separate contingency period for an appraisal, and you have to spell out how many days it is. Okay, so many of us put 21 days here. That's usually pretty good. One person put 14. That can be done, but it's a bit tight. And somebody put NA. Definitely don't put NA. Okay, definitely don't put NA. 21 days is probably pretty good. What we want to do is to make sure that we have an appraisal that is completed and turned in before the end of this period. Okay. Now, in a perfect world, okay, let me say one more thing first. If the appraisal is low, it is below the sales price, let's say, or the contract price. The contract price, let's say, is $325. Appraisal comes in at $320. You got to go and turn in the copy of the appraisal with an amendment to reduce the sales price and say, I'd like to buy this home for $320, or I'd like you to reduce the price to $320. And then they have a couple days to respond, usually 3 days to respond. And then it's a negotiated item, okay? As long as the seller says no, meaning I'm not going to do that, or I'll lower it to $323, which is essentially saying no, then at that point, the buyer can leave the deal. So as long as they turned in that low appraisal within the time period, leave the deal with no penalty, okay? It just becomes a new round of negotiation. If the buyer doesn't get the appraisal value, then they have the ability to leave the contract, okay? If they do get the appraisal or the value lowered or the sales price lowered, they're obligated to move forward with the price or with the sale. Now they'll just buy it for $320, okay? They are not obligated to leave the deal though. So let's say the sales price is $325, the appraisal comes in at $320, and they ask to reduce the price and the seller says no. The buyer could move forward with the property. Let's say it was a unique property or something like that, or they didn't care, they just needed to buy the home, whatever, right? Remember, the appraiser is not like God. That's just one person's opinion of value at that day. And clearly we had a difference of opinion of value on a different day, right? It's just one more roadblock to getting this deal done. Okay, so what would happen in that respect is the bank would loan 90% on the appraisal value, which is $320. The buyer would bring 10% of the $320, and then you still have to make up that $5,000 gap. The buyer would bring 100% of that in cash. That is allowed. Make sense? Does everyone follow that? Okay, yeah. Beautiful. Now, let's go back for a second. In a perfect scenario, I would like enough time to resolve any inspection-related issues before my buyer buys the appraisal. The appraisal is usually going to run you somewhere between $350 and $450. Okay, so what I want to happen is, or let me say it the other way. What I do not want to happen is I don't want to be on day, let's say, 7 of a 10-day due diligence period and have negotiated a 14-day appraisal contingency, and there's not enough time to order the appraisal contingency after the end of the due diligence period and get it back by the end of the appraisal contingency, what's going to end up happening is we're going to have a home inspection. There's going to be a handful of stuff that's wrong with the house. Let's say some wood rot, maybe a toilet needs to be replaced, maybe there's a roof leak, maybe the HVACs need to be serviced, you know, whatever, just the normal old stuff. And I get an amendment to address concerns. Let's say I'm the seller. I get an amendment to address concerns from the buyer saying, hey, fix all this. It's a couple $1,000s worth of stuff. And then 10 minutes later, I get a call from the appraiser saying, hey, the buyer's appraiser would like to come out at 2 o'clock tomorrow. I'm like, well, I guess they don't care about all this repairs then, because they just dropped another $450 into the deal. Make sense? So everything is a negotiation. Even if it's not spoken, you're communicating desire or a lack of desire, or interest or a lack of interest, or assertiveness or a lack of assertiveness, right? So if I get that message, I'm going to say to myself, well, I'm not going to agree to this. I'm going to have my seller not agree to as much of this stuff as I might have before, because they just invested another $450 into the deal. Does everyone follow what I'm saying? So in a perfect scenario, what I want to do from a buyer standpoint is resolve any of those inspection related issues, have them fully execute an amendment to address concerns, then order the appraisal. Because I don't want my buyer spending $450 on a home that they're ultimately not going to buy. Does that make sense? Or I might call the lender and say, hey, we're just waiting on final signatures. Do not order that appraisal until I say go. And then as soon as I get it, I say go. And I know I have a tendency to sound harsh, but you got to work with A players. You only get one chance to screw up in my world. You goof on one of that thing and it costs my buyer or my seller hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're done. We're not going to talk about how you screwed up. We're just going to be done, right? I've told you that story about the most expensive home I ever put under contract that did not close, okay, where the home inspector, who obviously we don't work together, brought the wife of the couple. We were kind of all sitting around this real fancy kitchen. Again, most expensive home I ever put under contract, didn't close it, and grabs the wife and says, hey, I noticed some issues in the laundry room. Since you'll be doing most of the laundry, why don't you come over here and let me show it to you? I literally almost fainted on the spot. And once that experience was done, I put my arm around the guy. I said, that was completely unacceptable, and we will not be doing business again. I don't even want to hear your defense. We're done. See what I'm saying? You got to have A players on your team. All right, what are you guys hearing? Okay, and then the last page is the signature page, right? Same information as before. If there's additional signatures, let's say it's 3 buyers or 3 sellers, maybe, you know, it's a sisters or brothers or something like that, or, you know, a couple and a father or whatever it may be, then you can include additional signature pages. If there's not additional signature pages, obviously don't check there. And there's no place for you to put the buyer's contact information. So of course you don't have to worry about sharing that. Okay. What did you guys, how was this experience? Was this helpful? Was this scary? Tell me what you're thinking right now.
I thought it was helpful for sure.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I liked it as well.
I'm thinking I want to do it again.
Okay.
Redo.
Why don't we do this then? We've done the purchase and sale, and we can do reminders, you know, later on. If you obviously, if you need help, you want it to like, hey, real life, I just wrote this purchase and sale and I want somebody to look over it. Just send it to me, send it to Susan, send it to Pam, send it to Kathy. Pam, by the way, Pam's been my partner basically for the last, 8 years or so. And she always watches my business for me between Friday and Saturday night. I'm off. So I'm not touching text, email, cell phone, anything. So if you ever need any assistance during that time, please just call Pam directly. She knows, she's probably the smartest person in the entire building on contracts. Okay.
Well, would Is there an option if we want to continue with the exercise to have someone counter offer us so we know what that experience is on the offer we submitted?
Yeah, we could do that. Absolutely. So let me think of what the kind of the cleanest way to do that is, and I'll pitch it to everyone, and we can go through that exercise. I also want to go through the exercise.
I'd like to know how to counter and what forms you need, and like that's
exactly. Let me think of the way I want to present that so it's clean and effective, and we're all kind of working off the same paperwork. And I also want to do an exercise where we complete a FHA loan exhibit too, because you'll probably see a lot of that. And I want to make sure you can fill that out properly too. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Don't forget Bold 100 tomorrow. If you have not sent me an address or you need help in any way with the preparations, let me know. And I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, Dale.